Hey everyone, this is a presentation that I've been working on for a few years now and have presented a few times live to different teams. And I thought that now would be a good time to make a recording and put it up on YouTube because it is a pretty decent resource, I think, for scouting and strategy and kind of fills a bit of a hole in the current resources that are out there that are at least relatively popular. So the title obviously is Event Scouting and Strategy. So this whole presentation has a focus around actually being at said event and maximizing what you can do and making strategies that do not suck. So who am I? I'm Brennan, and I'm the lead FRC mentor for 4476. I've been designing scouting systems since 2009, and I've been involved heavily in strategy since 2012. Various roles I've been in for the kind of scouting process and what all of that entails. So scouting, strategy, drive team, basically pretty much everything there. And I've also had some VRC experience from 2010 to 2014. So also have some kind of context for VRC and somewhat FTC. So the whole question this presentation tries to answer is you arrive at an event, what can you do to maximize your odds of winning or being successful at that event, making it to the next stage? Well, the answer is scouting and strategy. Scouting and strategy, I consider the two most important roles during a competition, and it really can directly impact your robot performance. And the reason why I think it's the most important is because it's very easy to change the way that you're doing things or your strategy, and that can have a large impact on your robot performance. Having a good strategy, knowing who to pick, that kind of thing. With a good robot and a bad strategy, you can really suffer. You might not be as successful as you should be. There are lots of examples and teams of that make the wrong choice, especially at the championship level, where they can cause issues of the team doesn't get as far as they possibly could. Number one seeds falling in divisions, especially happening this year at Detroit 2019. Scouting and strategy help bring the most out of your robot. So what you what you have is you can't do that much with your robot. You can do some small changes, maybe tune some things up, but knowing who your partners are, who you're against, that kind of stuff can really elevate your performance, even if you don't actually improve your robot. So, what is scouting? Well, it's collecting robot information. So, how much do they score? Where do they score? What the robot is, created out of? What dimensions sometimes? That kind of stuff. And strategy is how you use that information to create some sort of game plan. So, how are you going to actually play the match? That kind of thing. So some basic definitions that hopefully most of you know, qualitative and quantitative. Those are going to be talked a lot about in this presentation, so make sure that you're familiar with the difference here. So when I talk about strategy, there's sort of something that I call strategy flows, and that basically means that you're describing the beginning part of strategy to like the end part, the result. What's the whole point of the data that you're taking, and where do you go with that? And we're going to talk about that. So there's kind of different flows depending on what situation you're in. There's kind of a standard one which we'll go over, but there are some modifications that you have to obviously make based on some of the changing variables in your kind of environment of matches, right? So time constraints, when you have really close matches that are like basically back to back, you may not be able to get through all the different parts of this guideline. Locked alliances, right? So for eliminations, if you have a set alliance, some of this stuff maybe changes because you already have that pre-built relationship with those teams and you're kind of stuck with them. Different types of scouting systems. So Maybe you're collecting certain data, or you're doing things in a different way, or off-season events where there's a really shortened period of time, and especially one-day off-season events, you don't really have the pick list meeting night. So for the thing that I'm gonna kind of talk about, it's important to keep these steps in order. You can't really skip things because each of them has an important part in the strategic role of your team and what you could be doing to maximize your potential at an event, robot performance wise. So this is the kind of basic qualification strategic flow that our team follows, and I recommend other people do. So we have, data collection, which goes into, analyzing that data. From that data, you go into a preliminary plan. So you come up with kind of a basic strategy, alliance collaboration. So you take that strategy, bring it to the alliance, kind of be like, hey, this is what we were thinking, etc. Recap your plan, match execution and adaptation. So that's on the field, you know, taking your plan, putting it into action, adapting anything that might have gone wrong during the match, and then finally video review and reflection. So talking about what kind of happened during the match, what you can do better. So we're going to start with the first one, data collection, and we're going to talk about best practices. So priority number one is always um, data integrity. When you talk about data integrity, that means that you know that your data is correct. If your data is incorrect, there's a lot of bad things that can happen. Invest most of your time into how you use the data. So, interpreting that data, right? Just because you have a number or you have a list of numbers doesn't mean that that data is necessarily super useful. What can you look at? Can you look at standard deviations? Can you look at averages, medians, means? Maxes and mins are also important when you're talking about that. What kind of information can you glean from your data, and how can you use it to make yourself uh, more successful? Uh, do not collect data that you aren't sure of the use case. So that means if you're collecting something that you're not sure you're actually going to be using, don't use it. Uh, you know, most of this point comes from a lot of the pit scouting the teams do, but to some degree there is some uh, uh, match scouting stuff that we'll talk about later. That teams uh, that I bid on per se haven't really used the data. So it's just a case by case basis. But if you're not actually using a data set or like part of the data very much, then uh, don't record it because it's clearly not that useful. Uh, Make sure that everyone has proper training to scout. That's a big deal for when we come back to data integrity. Um, if your scouts aren't trained, they don't know the game that well, they don't know the sheet that well, they make mistakes, they cause errors in the data set. Lastly, value your scouts. A lot of teams really don't value their scouts. It's kind of the uh, role that you get as a leftover. It's not a valued role. It's somebody that didn't get drive team, didn't get pit crew, um, didn't get chairman's or award submission roles. What you want to do is really value your scouts, because if the scouts don't feel valued, they're not gonna put that much time into it or effort. They're gonna feel like it's some lame job that doesn't matter. And when they feel like that, then your data starts to suffer, right? You're not as accurate. People miss things. They aren't as interested in, invested in things. And there's a few different ways that you can try and improve that. But starting really with your team culture, right? So going back to previously, it really matters that you emphasize how important strategy and scouting is, and how valued those members are. Just because you say that it's important doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually acting like it. So, you know, praise your scouts regularly for doing a good job and finding things. Highlight some of the good things that they do. Make them feel valued. So data integrity. One of the best ways to do that, well, there's a few different ways, I guess, but one of the best ways is uh, having data verification. So what I mean by that is you have some sort of methodology where you um, make sure that your data is correct. You have some sort of checks in place. It's almost like unit testing. Um, for example, you can have automatic logical detection. So, add up the points for cargo, count how many cargo were scored for the 2019 game, count how many cargo were scored, and make sure that when you do the math, all the points add up. So, if I scored 3 cargo and I have 12 points, then something's wrong. We're missing 1 cargo for the cargo score. You can do that kind of stuff automatically with your data systems. So that's probably the best way to do it because it does it automatically. You don't have to do mental math or anything like that. Obviously, the second option is mental math. Sometimes it's really hard to uh, scout things. For example, 2017 fuel. Sometimes it's hard to count exactly how many fuel or they scored, or 2009 moon rocks. Um, it's not easy sometimes when you're shooting a whole bunch of game pieces to actually count how many points or how many game pieces were scored. So sometimes you have to do mental math. Does the math check out, basically? The third thing that you can do is sanity check, and sanity check is the bare minimum thing that you should be doing uh, on data entry. A lot of teams will do this after the fact. They'll figure out that, hey, this doesn't make sense, but the person who's doing the data entry, be it like a specific person or whether or not you're doing some like Scantron thing or the scout itself, make sure that it actually makes sense, and you can implement this into your apps too if you're doing like a scouting app system. Raise flags if somebody says, oh well, they scored 200 cargo. Well, that's probably not the case. Well, definitely not the case. So make sure that there's no like typos or that kind of thing. The second way that you can attack this kind of data integrity problem is minimizing scouting mistakes. So there's a couple ways that I suggest here. So feedback to the scouts after errors. So one of the things that we really try and focus on is when we receive the data, if there is determined that there's bad data or somebody missed something, what we do is immediately the scouts get feedback, ideally, about what kind of mistakes they did. For example, like, hey, somebody's missing a cargo, somebody else uh, should have scored 1 more cargo or 1 less cargo. You can talk to that specific scout and be like, hey, by the way, you missed a cargo that they scored here. Just be aware of that kind of thing. uh, In-depth training. So doing training workshops for your scouts every year, talking about the kind of things that you can improve on and how you can um, improve their comments, which is a big deal. uh, Recognition of the work they do. If they feel recognized and valued, then they're more likely to put time into the scouting process. And if they're doing that, then they're probably making less mistakes. You want to include them on improvements to the system. So sometimes scouting systems have issues where, either preference or like bad issues where there's bugs or certain values aren't being used. Make sure that the scouts are involved in that system, every single scout involved in that system and making it better. So take feedback after the competition, before the competition. Make sure that they're aware of how the system works and what kind of improvements they can do. You'd be surprised how many just generic scouts would be like, oh, I'd really like it if the sheet was laid out differently, or the app was laid out differently so that this was first and this was second. That way I don't have to flip back and forth or whatever. There's a whole bunch of different things, and if they're feeling that they have some sort of ownership over the entire system, they're going to be more interested in scouting. Make sure that they're invested in the match. So something that is pretty famous is the Simbucks example from 11-14, where they have some sort of like betting system on the match. You can do like fantasy drafts where you pick teams and you like kind of are cheering on, then you're invested in certain teams doing well. Um, there's many ways to to get them invested in the match. Talk about over unders, um, those kind of bets. Those are fun. Keep them interested in what's happening in the match, even if they're not necessarily scouting. Um, express data in a way that indicates your certainty. So sometimes, there's a whole bunch of significant digits like 0.0111 or whatever for something that's like not very certain. So, for example, fuel's another for a good example. If you have a certain number of significant digits on uh, a piece of data, then you may or may not think that it's super accurate or not, right? And when you're separating teams by like the second or third digit, then well, how sure are we that this is actually correct? Lastly, if you get bad data, remove it entirely. Nothing worse than having bad data, because if you have bad data, that just means that you're going to have issues later on down the road. You pick off some bad data, all of a sudden you picked a team that you either was, better, or you missed out on a team that should have been picked. So here's a 2018 example. Um, and I want you guys to just think about it for a little bit. Which team would you rather pick? So take a look at the two teams. You're the first alliance captain. You've kind of narrowed it down to two different teams. It's probably not like a super strong regional or event, but your two teams are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6, 7, 8. And when you look at that, I'll give you guys a couple seconds. Okay, so even if you're not familiar with the 2018 game, you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4 has better stats on all of the metrics that we're caring about right now. So average scale cubes, average switch cubes, and average vault cubes. So it seems like 1, 2, 3, 4 is by far the obvious pick, right? Because they're just better on every single metric. If you picked 1, 2, 3, 4, you could be wrong. And it's not because you're interpreting the numbers incorrectly. Well, how did this happen? Well, there's a lot of things that could happen, and what could have happened in this example is maybe the data is invalid. We got some bad data. Some of the things that can happen is a typo of a number, right? So you're trying to type something and you put in a higher or lower number. Incorrect counting from a scout over time. This is kind of less obvious and hard to detect, right? You're off by one, plus or minus one, a lot. That adds a lot of error, especially when it's built over time. Sometimes scouts watch the wrong robot, right? They're watching a robot that is really good and scoring in like high goals, but the robot that they should be watching literally can't score in the high goals. So, you know, then you have this bad data where a team that's literally incapable of doing something now has information that's saying that they can do that. You can insert a value in the wrong place. So you can put your team number in like number of cargo scored, for example, in 2019. So our team number 4476 in cargo scored, that'll boost the average a lot. So, depending on how many matches you get, you have an insanely high average all of a sudden. So if you're just looking at averages, that can cause issues. Um, yeah, and I guess another common one, autonomous and teleop mix-ups, right? So, you know, they scored 5 in teleop, but you put it in autonomous by accident because they're similar uh, names, right? Scored cargo is still scored cargo in teleop and sandstorm this year, um, but obviously they didn't score 5 cargo in sandstorm. Uh, Another common thing that happens is the scout misses a part of the match or lost focus or got distracted and they missed some key moment or some scoring. Another thing that can happen is your code bug. a code bug. So you could have incorrect sums or averages or etc. So you want to really test that. So what do we learn? We need to make sure that we trust our data. 100%. That's the most important thing. If you have bad data, it is useless. It is worse than having no data. Make sure that your data is good. Bad data just makes you pick wrong. No data, at least you know that you don't have the data and you're not going to make incorrect assumptions. Okay, so talking about collection types. Waffles 4476 implies three different types of data collection. Field scouting or match scouting is largely quantitative data, and it's the most important method of scouting for sure. You get most of your valuable information because it is actually talking about what the robot is doing, what it's performing, how it's actually doing on the field. Pit scouting, you can get really specific technical information about a team. What are their abilities? What kind of mechanisms do they maybe have? What kind of capabilities do they have? Sometimes like frame size or ground clearance is really important for games where you have to climb with another team. Practice field scouting is something that is fairly rare that we do somewhat officially. Um, and that is really nice because it has predictive power of knowing what robots are working on or what teams are working on. Are they working on a shooter? Are they working on their climber? Are they working on their scoring mechanism or whatever? Maybe a new autonomous. Um, Making sure that you know what's going on and what they're working on can give you a lot of advantages and often helps you find that like clutch last pick that just got something working. So, field scouting. Uh, Field scouting is watching the competition field and making sure that you're getting all the information off the matches that you care about. Field scouting should generally be quantitative data, and the reason for that is, that's the numbers part that you really need to be able to tell how good a team is scoring. Quantitative data is non-subjective, so making sure that you're getting all the information that is non-subjective, make sure makes that make sure that you're able to have a unbiased opinion of a team. Uh, Qualitative comments are also good in the quantitative in sort of the field scouting part, but make sure that you're not doing them too much and make sure that any qualitative stuff is not not turned into a number as possible. Like, don't try not to turn them into a number. Uh, so the things you want to take, like numbers, for example, is how many did they score? How long did it take? Uh, did they do anything in end game? If so, what did they do and how? Um, were there any penalties or cards assessed to that team? That's another big deal. So, like I mentioned just a second ago, in general, you don't want to make qualitative data into a number, which is somewhat quantitative. Um, it's important to not do that because things are not the same. Like the balances of scales are not the same. So if I were one of the common things that people rank teams on are like uh, how good their driver is or how good their defense is. Those are two pretty common things that happen from teams, and uh, my 10 out of 10 might not be your 10 out of 10. My 10 out of 10 might be your you know 20 out of 10. The scales are not balanced, and if you're having a whole bunch of different scouts doing that, it's really hard to keep it consistent because everybody has different reference points. If you do need to take it and turn it into a number, try and use systems that force a scout to make decisions. So even numbers on ranking systems is nice because, especially like the out of four, so 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1 being bad, 2 being below average, 3 being above average, 4 being great. That kind of balances the scale a little bit and makes them actually think about what is average from what they've seen, um, and hopefully normalizes some of the different perspectives on what my perfect version of defensive driving, for example, could be compared to somebody else's. There's another method which 1678 uses, which I thought was super cool. And if you wanted more information, they also have a scouting workshop videos. Highly recommend watching them as well. But basically, the gist of it is that you rank each team on the alliance from 1 to 3 on a specific aspect of the game. I think they use like driver skill, for example, and then you can parse that data into, well, 1678 was better than uh, 254 in this match, but 254 was better than X, and then they generate a list based off of relative comparisons, right? So they're just comparing, instead of actually having like an average of 1 to 3 or 1 to 4, they're comparing it directly to two different teams. Each team gets compared, and that hopefully negates some of that issue of, oh, I don't know what driving skill my 10 out of 10 is your 5 out of 10. Pit scouting. Pit scouting is uh, not done amazingly in first, I believe, and hopefully I am here to help you get better at doing that. What you should do. So pit scouting is used to find out specific information about robots that A, you will use, and B, you can't effectively measure while doing field scouting or match scouting. So those are the two key things that you need. So if I'm actually going to use it and that I can't just like see it better on the field, I don't record dumb information. Dumb information is like something that you have no intent of using or a clear intent. For example, how many wheels do you have on your robot? Why do you need to know that? What use does it have? Very low usage, right? There's not really a clear thing. Maybe you'd say, oh, well, more wheels equals more traction, or maybe some cases you would have like a, climber platform that you're trying to get on. Maybe the wheels interfere with certain bars, but in general, stuff like that doesn't matter. It doesn't have a clear use uh, for your strategy, and that kind of question is asked way too much. Uh, you don't want to try and ask something that you can use your eyes to see. For example, how many wheels does your robot have? You can oftentimes just look at the robot and see how many wheels they have. If that question is actually really important to you, that's great. The other thing that you don't want to do is record something that is better measured somewhere else. For example, uh, you know, do you score on the high goal? Well, you can see that in the match scouting, so you don't need to ask, you know, hey, can you do this? Um, because you can see, well, have they ever scored in the high goal in the match? Because you don't care if they say that they can score on the high goal, but they don't actually do it during the match. Another example that of that is just like, autonomouses is actually a pretty decent example of something that you might want to ask, because sometimes autonomouses don't get used, but they may have them, so that's a decent example. um, yeah, so try and avoid those three things. When you're talking to them, actually try and engage with them. Just because you're asking the questions doesn't mean you're engaging with them. There's a lot of pit scouters out there that kind of just, uh, mindlessly read through the questions, don't actually look at the robot, um, don't actually think about the questions that they ask. For example, there's a lot of teams that are like, "Hey, can you score on the high goal?" And then if you say no, then they're like, okay, so how many high goal game pieces do you score on average? It's like, well, we don't score on the high goal, So therefore, we don't have any, we're not scoring that. Or climbing is an example of, uh, my team. We haven't had a climber in a couple of years. Make sure that you're actually paying attention to what the person is saying and don't ask silly questions. Uh, Feel free to ask questions for your own personal curiosity that are unrelated to the team and your pit scouting, right? So, hey, that's a really cool wheel there, or how does your climber work? I don't really understand. You can learn a lot of things by looking at other teams' robots and ask. So these questions should largely be qualitative. Don't ask things like, how many game pieces do you score? It doesn't matter what the team says, because the only thing that matters is how much they actually score. We don't care about their perceptions of what they score, and oftentimes their perceptions are very overblown. When you talk about averages, teams often talk about their maxes rather than their average. It's like, oh yeah, we average 10 game pieces. Well, there's very few teams that average 10 game pieces in 2019. So, what are some other good possible pit scouting questions? Well, like I mentioned before, sometimes frame dimensions are useful for when you have a climber or some sort of assisting thing, or you're trying to work out if both of you can fit on, for example, the level 3 platform for the 2019 game. That kind of stuff is important because you want to know how much of the platform they take up. But if that's not a big deal to you, don't ask that question. Just because somebody else asks it doesn't mean that you have to ask it. Another really not so great example of pit questions is like, how many motors are on your drivetrain? Broadly, you don't really care. Uh, Occasionally, there's some cheesecaking that you want to do, or a team wants to add motors to your drivetrain to try and make you more defensive or have more power. That's fine to ask specifically, but you don't want to ask like 254 or 2056, hey, how many drive motors do you have on your drivetrain? That's really lame. It doesn't matter. When you're looking at first picks, a lot of these questions are not relevant, and you shouldn't be asking like high level teams some of these basic questions like, how many wheels do you have on your robot? How many motors do you have on your robot? Uh, what's your strategy is another weird one. Good things that you can ask high level teams. Um, you know, Once again, if you have a climber, what's the dimensions of your climber? Are we compatible? Can we go to the practice field and try this out? That kind of stuff. So, speaking of practice field, data collection on the practice field is a big thing that teams need to be doing more of. It's a super underutilized method of getting amazing data, especially right before alliance selections. Because things like that happens, like I just mentioned, is, oh, team A and team B trying to do a double climb together. Is it possible? Are they able to do it? Hey, if they're working together, then we know that probably they're going to pick each other, because they're obviously not doing it for no reason. And it gives you an idea of how maybe the alliance selection may progress. Team A was likely going to pick Team B, so we know that both of them are off the table and we can't pick Team B. Or maybe you can go up to Team B and say like, hey, I saw that you were double climbing with this team. Want to try double climbing with us, etc. Counter offer, that kind of stuff. So it's super useful. The other really big thing is, like I mentioned before, is those teams that are struggling, they can't quite get their thing working, especially for autonomouses. Their autonomous is just not quite working. They're not getting their two hatch or two cube autonomous really working. You can take a look at that and you can say, hey, I just saw it work on the practice field 10 times in a row. They may be a really good option for, a low seed alliance, like 8th seed alliance captain that needs something crazy to pull out to try and upset the number one alliance. Or in some cases, a third robot that you can pick up. Or, if you're a number one seed, you might have limited selection and you saw this one team that was practicing. trying to get better or whatever. So you can see what their skill level is. There's been a lot of times where we've used this kind of approach and found really good teams, especially as third robots, that suddenly get their shooter working, suddenly get their autonomous working, and has led us to greater success at events. So when you're at the practice field, you want to monitor the teams that are on there. So what are they working on? How successful is it? Like, for example, autonomous is they ran it 10 times. It worked 6 out of 10. That's a percentage. Uh, One of the other things that you can do is there something that we can assist them with, right? So maybe they're working on a climber or like a mechanical part, and you just can't get it. They can't quite get it working. Maybe you have a similar mechanism and you've done a similar prototype to what they're doing. Maybe you have some ideas on how to fix that problem. That's something that you can investigate into and try and repair their robot or make their robot better, and then all of a sudden they become a much better pick for you later on in the competition. Um, yeah, so that gives all of this gives you a big leg up on people who aren't watching the practice field. So data collection, there's sort of supplemental information that you can use. There's a whole bunch of metrics that you can use uh, that are very useful for doing predictive power stuff. So wide, broad predictions when you have low information and you don't actually have any scouting, or when you have no information and you're just walking into an event or walking into a team that you haven't really been able to see yet, just to kind of give you a general idea of how good they are. So there's CCWM, which is calculated contribution to winning margin, which is okay-ish. OPR, offensive power rating, is one of the most popular ones that you'll see on the Blue Alliance and stuff. That's a pretty decent one to look at for general skill. ELO, which is maintained largely by Caleb on Chief Delphi, is a really good resource for predictions, and he's working on he has event simulators and stuff like that which you can use, and those are great resources and we've used them as well, um, just to kind of get a bit of an idea of where teams should perform. True skill is another thing that's been thrown around, less popular but also interesting. You can do some reading on that, and then DPR, which people for some reason won't let go of. DPR, definitely pathetic rating. It is terrible. It is the worst thing to ever exist when it comes to people talking about their team. It's basically noise, has zero value, never use it, it's trash. Anybody who says that it's useful or ever looks at it is just being silly. The reason why it's trash, it's DPR is basically the opposite of OPR. OPR takes your contribution, tries to estimate how much your score went up based on you being on that alliance. DPR is the opposite. It has how much the opponent's score went down based on you playing against them. Unfortunately, uh, in the real world, when we have these kind of questions, very rarely is the opponent's performance in points affected by a defended robot largely. You can make some small differences, but the biggest things that really impact you are like a robot being dead, for example. So if one of their main scoring robots is dead, then you'll have a really high DPR because their points dropped super low. So there's a whole bunch of noise, basically zero uh, applications, so don't ever use it. The other thing that you can do is you can watch official practice matches on the first day of your event, if they have them. Those are super useful because they'll give you kind of a general idea of what teams are working on. Don't take it literally because oftentimes teams will kind of just be focusing on one thing. You may see like a team try and climb like 5 times because they're just testing out their climber, trying to make sure it works, or they're only scoring low to just practice that. Oftentimes they're just doing kind of random things, but it'll give you an idea of generally their performance. Okay, so for data collection, the other thing that we do is we have strategy people. These strategy people carry a notebook and pencil or pen and pencil everywhere, and they take notes. They're constantly watching. They're constantly trying to take, you know, qualitative notes on things. And some of the things that they talk about is patterns in play. So, for example, this team always goes to the right side rocket, or the closest rocket goes for the hatch. They go two hatches and then two cargo, or maybe they go all hatches and then try and fill up the cargo. That gives you information. Maybe some of the weaknesses that they have, like if you bump them from the corner, they miss all the time, or if you wait, or it takes like about a second for them to score every single time. So if you bump them at this specific second, then it's great. One of the best examples I have is from 2012. Team Dave, 3683, had this really awesome robot that was a level 2 scorer with three basketballs, but it was all automatic. So they'd lift up their arm, pivot, and then shoot all three balls into it rapidly. But once it started, they couldn't stop it, or it was all like automated to try and make it faster, right? So as soon as you start seeing that elevator go up a little bit for them to score, you just bump them and they miss all three because there was no way to stop them, stop the actual action from happening, and that caused them to get knocked out at the Waterloo Regional. So noticing stuff like that is really big deal because you can exploit their weaknesses or their patterns. Uh, Talk to the teams, make notes about their robot, learn about their robot, and the people that you talk to. Sometimes you'll have really great experiences, like talking to people and asking them about their robot. Hey, how's this work? What else can you do? That kind of stuff. Uh, Look for weaknesses against the top teams at your event. If you have to play against them, how are you going to beat them? What are their weaknesses? Do they have stress problems when they play defense? Is there a specific way that they always play under defense? Um, can you bump them in a certain way? That kind of stuff. I guess going back another example. For example, in 2014, even though the game was like symmetrical, oftentimes teams would at the start of teleop, they'd go to the same side of human player every single time to try and inbound the yoga ball that they had to score, park on that one side. Then all of a sudden, the teams planned to go to the left side, and they go to the left side every single time. The human player runs over there, the inbounder drives over there. But if you're blocking it, that makes it really hard for them to inbound, and then maybe they have to go to the right side. Then you just save like 5 seconds at least, delaying their scoring potential. Maybe that 5 seconds is the difference between one more cycle, which in that game was a lot of points. So doing that kind of stuff can have a large impact. Okay, so going to data analysis. Best practices. You have to know what stats mean. Just because they're a number, you have to actually understand what the implications of that are. You know, what is the min? What is the max? What is the average? What does that actually mean? Where did the points go? Make sure that your data is easily accessible. If you can't access your data, it's not very useful. Well, actually useless. So make sure that that's good. Um, when you're analyzing your data, especially for qualifications, how does your line stack up to theirs? What are their averages? What are your averages? What are your maxes? What are their maxes? Confirm that you know maybe their max is lower than your average. In that case, you know you're probably going to win, or vice versa. If your max, your alliance's max is lower than their average, you're probably going to lose. That's important information to know. What are their strengths and weaknesses? Are they really good at hatches? Are they really good at cargo? Are they really good at climbing? Where do most of their points come from? Make sure you're objectively evaluating each situation that you're in. So this helps you by looking at that quantitative data as being like, oh, well, we're likely down by 2 cargo or something. So how are we going to make up that 6 points? Can we get another climb? Can we get some more game pieces? Can we defend them for more? Uh, how can you present your data in effective, easy to understand ways? So, more than just a number. Maybe there's some visuals, Tableau. Maybe you can use some graphs, some things that you can use to try and visualize where the gap is and what the data is a little bit better. Uh, Potential pitfalls that you can have. How accurate is it, and how precise is it? So accuracy, meaning that how accurate is it, means that how uh, how similar it is to the real world example, kind of. So if they scored 8 cargo in real life and you write down 8 cargo, that means it's accurate. Precise is how precise is it? How certain are you of the answer? So in that case, you're pretty certain. How can the number you are looking at be over or underinflated? One of the really great examples is like for 2019, maybe the team has defended a lot. Maybe their numbers are under inflated because they're literally being defended every single match. Meanwhile, a team maybe has really high numbers, but they're never being defended. Another example is for 2017 with gears. There was only so many gears that you could score, and once you reach that cap, you didn't really have much else to do. So maybe you're being defended, and another team's scoring a lot, and then all of a sudden you run out of scoring opportunities. Again, maybe in 2019, another example is scoring in the low goal, right? If you're scoring in the low goal, all the low goals fill up. Maybe your partners are all low goalers. All of a sudden, that match looks a lot worse because you didn't have as many opportunities, and then you just had to play defense and then like park or climb at the end of the match. So everything can be over or under inflated, often by significant margins. Make sure you look at your numbers. Look at max, medians, and mins. That'll give you a good story over what their data set looks like. Who are they playing with or against? Maybe there's a really good team, but for example, in 2019, they play with 1114 and 2056. Well, all of a sudden they're the defense robot. Just because they're good doesn't necessarily mean that um, that they're the best on their alliance. And maybe they score 0 cargo that match, and then that drops their average a lot. You have to look at these kind of things. Uh, for against, maybe there's a really good defender on the other alliance, and you can see that that defender made a massive impact on their score. Maybe they died for a few matches, right? So if they had a few dead matches, then that's going to obviously lower their score a lot. Did they fix a mechanical or code issue? All of a sudden, they start scoring a lot at the end of the match or at the end of the competition. They started off scoring 1 or 2 game pieces, and now they're scoring 9. Well, what happened? Maybe they scored, maybe they fixed a code issue, or maybe they fixed a mechanical issue, and all of a sudden they're a more competent robot. But average doesn't take that into account. So trends are important. Make sure that you're valuing the most recent data the most. Try and find a balance between old and new data. Okay, so moving on to preliminary plan. So this is kind of the scenario where you have your data, you've interpreted it, you have a general idea of what each robot's capable of. Now you evaluate all the strengths and weaknesses of all the robots. Look for role players. Make sure that everyone's always doing something. In 2019, sometimes you have teams that are really good at hatches. They can do cargo, but they're not that good at cargo. Um, you know, maybe you say, hey, maybe the option is you guys just do hatches the entire match, and then we fill out the cargo in wherever you score. That's going to maximize your score. Or maybe a defender is really good. You want to look at what potential strategy they might run, your opposing alliance. How can you try and negate that or nullify it, still win no matter what? When you're making a plan, always, 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 the number one priority has to be winning, since that's going to give you the most amount of points. Even if you're low ranked, you got to work with the teams that you're with. Make sure that Sometimes you're playing with a team that has ranking implications, and you've got to focus on, working as an alliance to meet the needs of the entire alliance. After you've thought about winning, you've made sure that you have a plan to win. Consider tiebreakers, and how can those be maximized? So extra RPs. That's where this falls into. First win, then worry about extra RPs. What about tiebreakers like cargo score or climbing score? That kind of stuff. Then maximize that out. After all of that is done, then you think about how you can show off your skills. And this is really hard for some of the teams that are low ranked and don't have an opportunity to actually be ranked, or be picking. Uh, it gives a really bad impression when your only priority is to show off your skills. Make sure that you do all of these other things first for your alliance. And then after you have all that plan, how can you slightly modify the strategy to make sure that you're showing off your skills? One of the examples that I have is in 2011 at Champs, we had a team on our alliance, that really, really wanted to deploy their minibot. And for those of you who aren't aware, minibots, there were only two poles that the minibots could run off of. So there's only two teams that could deploy. They had the least reliable minibot on the entire alliance, and they were really determined to show that their minibot could work, because they had just fixed it or whatever. But we really wanted to ensure that we got the win. What ended up happening is, they were so frustrated and really wanted to show that they could deploy their minibot that they went to the opponent's minibot poll and scored points for them, and actually got penalties because you weren't allowed to touch the minibot poll. So that really gave a bad taste in our mouth when you see a team literally sacrificing the win and scoring points for the other team to just show off, right? And I don't think it really looked good for other people, potentially looking to pick them, because even though maybe their minibot worked once, you saw that they were clearly going against the rules and getting a lot of points for the other alliance, and they ended up not being selected. So really don't do that. Really bad idea. 2018 scale scoring, often there would be kind of a debate over who's going to be the main scale scorer, and oftentimes you wouldn't have three at a time all scoring, because then you bump into each other. There's some teams that are really stubborn, that are like, oh, we need to score on the scale. We just fixed our problem. Blah 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 blah. I can sympathize. It's really nice, but find a match where that makes sense to do for the alliance. There's going to be a match where you're equal or better than the other scale scorers in the actual data. Um, 2019 rocket completion. Who's working on the rocket? Make sure you get out of the way. That kind of stuff. That was also a debate. Teams want to show off their rocket ability, but sometimes sacrifice the match by accident. It's important when you're coming up with this plan. Look for a starting point. You don't need to be perfect. Plans will change. So, preliminary plan. How do I win? Make sure that you're making your opponent use their brain. And this may sound funny, but the less you have to use your brain, the better, right? So during the match, the more that they have to think, the more prone they are to making mistakes. What you don't want to go into, especially when you're with against an alliance that is much stronger than you, is giving them a free ride. Just autopilot, score as many points, win the match, do nothing. Make them actually think. Make them have the potential to make mistakes. When you're discussing the plan and making the plan, um, make sure that you're thinking about that you can take away points. That's almost as good as getting points. So playing defense. Um, Obviously, if you only play defense and score 0 points, you have no ability to actually to win. But sometimes the deltas matter. Like you take your weakest robot, play defense on their strongest robot. That's another way to get points. Think about how to draw penalties. Are there situations where you can potentially get penalties given to you, or that will help you boost your score? For example, the rocket penalties for touching this year, or Israel this past year, 2019, there was a lot of shoving the robot onto the other alliance or onto the other side of the field, which would draw penalties and actually was a major decider for their event before the rules changed. Where can you play defense on the field? Maximize your impact on their scoring, minimize the amount of risk. So if the ideal position is uh, placing your robot in a place where there's high traffic and they need to go, but there's no protected zones and you can't get any penalties. Attack the area that they're going to be most impacted by. So a lot of teams make the mistake of playing defense against the number one team. The number one team oftentimes isn't the best person to play defense against because they're very practiced against defense. Defense isn't as effective on them. So sometimes you have to play against the second best robot to make that impact because that'll impact their score the most. Make sure you execute your plan well. That's a big thing, and make sure that everyone's working to a common goal. So make sure that everybody's united on what they want to do. Who should be involved? So take input from all scouts when you take the data. So hey, have you watched this team? What do you think of this team? What is strengths, weaknesses, etc. Limit the plan decisions to 2 to 3 people at most. Lead top scouts and your lead strategy people. The less people you have is is good because there's less cooks in the kitchen. You don't have to worry about a whole bunch of discussion and debate. Make sure you're having your best people. After you have your preliminary plan, 1 to 2 people should take that information to the next step in the strategic flow. And always make sure that you're having your best people working on it because that's going to have you the best outcome. So now we're moving to alliance collaboration here. Approach your partners about the upcoming match and have a discussion about the match plans. So you have to talk to your partners. You say, hey, how you doing? We have a match with you, etc. Things that you should have during this talk. A field diagram, super important because you could draw on it and kind of mark it up and say, you'll be positioned here, etc. Top-down view. You want to bring your data. So you want to say, hey, here's our data on you. You do this and this and this. We do this and this and this. Another thing that you want to bring is your potential plan in written form so that you make sure that you cover all the points of your initial plan and make sure that it's addressed, and you want to try and make sure that you haven't missed anything. When you're talking to teams, it's really important for everybody to have a voice. Really sucks when one team feels like they don't have a say in the conversation, and that causes conflict. So always start the strategy discussions with other teams with talking about what each team wants to do. So if you're leading the group, don't start off with saying, oh, we're going to do it this way. We're in charge. This is the way it's going to happen. You're going to do this. You're going to do that. We already have a plan. This is the way it's going to go. Talk about what they want to do. What are their goals? What do they want to show off? What's the plan? Do they want to go for the extra ranking point, etc.? You also want to ask, how's the robot performing? Hey, how's your robot doing? Looking good? Any problems? Anything we should be aware of? Do they want to try something new they haven't seen? Oftentimes, teams are like, we just got our climber working. We want to try climbing. Does that make sense in this case? So, coming up with a plan with your alliance partners. Make sure that you keep in mind your key objectives. First, winning, then good ranking tiebreakers. That should be what dictates your discussion. Make sure that you take all of your ideas and frame it around that. We want this to happen because winning. This is going to give us the best chance of winning because of XYZ. Be flexible with your plan. You may end up having to change your strategy a lot based on what you were originally thinking because one team just really doesn't want to do a specific thing that you were thinking of. A big example is defense. Lots of teams just really, really don't want to play defense, and that's okay. You have to still make sure that you're trying to get your key objectives, which are winning and a good tiebreaker. When presenting a preliminary plan, make sure you talk about each of these uh, points in the frame of winning and getting a tiebreaker. Try and be positive, avoid focusing on weaknesses, focus on their strengths. So maybe a team's not very good at scoring. Um, Talk about, hey, to win this match, there's a really good team on the other alliance. We want you to play defense because we think that that's the best way that you can have an impact on the score. Make sure that you always discuss backup plans for each of your scenarios. What happens if each robot breaks down? Or what if we start losing at a specific time? Or what if we're not reaching our goal? What if we don't have the rocket mostly complete by this time? What's the backup plan? Do we start scoring somewhere else? Do we keep going for it? Make sure that you talk about these contingency plans so that you don't have to think during the match, because remember, thinking during the match is bad. Conflict resolution when you're talking with an alliance. Unfortunately, conflict happens, especially at championship events when it's kind of the last event. There's no next event. Everything's on the line. If a team doesn't agree, explain your perspective in different words. Make an active effort to try and do this, because sometimes they just don't understand. We've had this kind of happen, and it was not a good experience, and we didn't do a good job of explaining in a different way that the team would understand. If you do this and you still can't agree, go with the strategy that the majority of teams on the alliance want. Make sure that you're a team player. Don't be that sore loser that's like, oh, this is the only way that we need to do it, blah, 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 and then complain about it. Make sure that you're all on the same page. All right, this isn't the ideal strategy that we'd like, but let's go with it. And often a suboptimal strategy is way better than two teams, fighting it out, trying to go for different things during the match. All right, so the next thing is the plan recap. Right before the match, you want to make sure that everybody knows what the plan is and inform any individuals that weren't at the strategy meeting about the plan. So that goes for human players, that goes for other teams. You want to make sure that they're good. So the drive coach should recap the plan with the alliance before they go on the field. Make sure everybody knows what it is and what the contingency plans are if there are issues. It really sucks to be on a match, think that everybody's good, go into the match, and then immediately nobody starts doing what the plan was. Make sure that everybody knows what the plan is going into the match. Don't let it fall apart. Specifically ask your drive teams, your partner drive teams, or your people on your drive team if they have any questions, if there's any concerns, if they're not clear on something, because it's better to talk about it now than during the match. So then we go into match execution. So the basics of it is, for us, we strongly recommend that the coach makes all the strategy calls and adaptations. So if there's a broken partner or we're losing and we need to make a change, they are in charge. They have the final say. The driver makes any driving adaptations. So like if the robot starts braking or if they can't drive, they calmly communicate it to the operator and the coach, and they kind of deal with it. And maybe they have to drive slower, or they have to, line up in a different way. They do that kind of that call. You don't want the coach saying, drive slower, or that kind of stuff. Um, Something almost always needs to change during the match, and that's okay. You can't plan for everything. Don't worry about it. Don't keep doing the same thing if it's not working. When that problem happens, there's a lot of teams that will just keep trying to pick up the same ball over and over again, or same game piece, or trying to score the same place. Don't do that. Try a different ball. Try doing a different uh, game objective. Try scoring it somewhere else. Don't keep doing the same thing. During the match, the coach should be focusing on what the goals of the match are and prioritize what is important to completing your objective. So going back to before, Well, how are we going to win? This is our win condition. How are we going to get their RP? This is our RP condition. Don't worry about making the perfect call. Look to improve your situation as quickly as possible. So don't be paralyzed by trying to calculate every single detail. Try and just make your situation better. You can always change it later. So maybe you're scoring hatches and you're like, oh crap, we need more points, so let's score cargo because they're more valuable. But maybe the right call was to go for your double climb. But you can change that later, like in the next few seconds. So during the match, um, there's a whole bunch of different communication rules that we have. Uh, the coach is the absolute dictator during the match. The reason why this is the case is because the coach has the most information. The coach doesn't have to do anything other than look at the field. They're not driving the robot. They're not loading game pieces. They're not trying to score. They're not trying to talk to their driver, or the operator and the driver, trying to organize that. They can talk to other partners, go and talk to them and be like, hey, what's wrong with the robot? Or hey, our robot's broken. They have the most information because they can look at the entire field. They don't have to look at their specific robot. They can say, "Oh, this robot's coming to play defense. Get ready for a team to play defense on you." They have the most information. They are going to be the most informed. They will have the best hope at making the right call for the match. So always listen to them. The driver dictates to the operator what the plan is for the specific robot. So, hey, we're driving over here. Get ready to pick up a ball. As a coach, inform the alliance partners if you're changing your plan. Make sure that they hear you. One of the worst things that happened to me uh, in 2018 is playing with a high-profile team and trying to communicate to them that we had an issue, but the team didn't respond and didn't hear. So that when it came to the part of actually executing the plan, we were supposed to climb with them. Um, they were confused because it was like, oh well, you were broken the entire time. Dang. Make sure that they actually hear you. Wait for some sort of confirmation or eye contact, that kind of thing. Another big thing is you can appoint a kind of shot caller for the entire alliance, especially during eliminations, to make sure that you're meeting your goals. Sometimes you need super reactive decision making, and when that happens, you need to make sure that 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 person is in charge of everything, makes the calls immediately, tries to improve the situation. So after the match, we do video review and reflection. Uh, so what you want to do is ask them why and how. So video review is something that we do immediately after the match, and it's super, super important for developing your drive team. You want to reflect on calls, discuss errors, and compliment good plays. And the reason why we do it immediately after is because it's fresh in your mind. Literally, they don't even push the robot back to the pit. We have the pit crew come out and grab the robot. We talk about anything that may need repair or changes, and then the drive team will immediately go into a review. So it's literally, 1 or 2 minutes after the match ends, we're reviewing the plays. That way, we are fresh in what just happened. We have somebody in the stands record it on a tablet with a decent camera. We prefer tablets because then you don't have to like upload it to a laptop or something like that to view it. It's immediate. The strategy team leads the discussion on improvements, and they bring the video to the drive team to review. And like I said, the pit crew picks up the robot on the way out. So you review it, you talk about the good things, the bad things, what you can improve on, why you won that match, maybe some of the goals that you didn't hit. So maybe you didn't get a certain RP. You see, oh, this team dropped or this team knocked a panel off. You should have recognized that, changed gears, went with a different strategy perhaps, or filled that spot. After that review, you ideally present the preliminary plan right after. So you talk about it with the drive team. You say, hey, this is our next match. This is the plan. This is where we're at. any questions or any concerns? Where's the robot at? Looked okay, etc. And then you immediately take that plan and go to your next alliance for qualifications. So this is normally where I would have questions, but obviously since there's a recording, there isn't any questions. But if you have any questions, you can post in the comments for the YouTube channel or message me on Discord or Chief Delphi. So kind of the last section of the team, of the presentation, sorry, is making a pick list. And this is kind of separate from the whole strategy flow. Actually, going back, just talking about the strategy flow, this is the concept that we've been using for several years and that I've been kind of developing. It's just to describe the taking the data to the end goal of performing on the match. So if you have any questions about that, let me know. So yeah, back to making a pick list. There's kind of two different styles of making a pick list. Sort of pseudo dubbed by me, like a standard way and then a specialized. So standard is just ranking teams in order of best to worst, top to bottom. What its advantages is it gives you a good idea of what the what alliances should form. So when you look at predicting who's going to pick who, you can kind of be like, okay, well, one's going to pick two, three's going to pick four, etc. on your list. It's also nice because it's easy to see what the next possible picks are because there's only a few teams in one single list. Specialized is also totally viable as well, and it kind of depends on the game. But you make different lists based on different attributes or objectives of the game. So sometimes you'll have like a first pick list, so like your first selection list and your second selection list. Sometimes you'll have like a defense list and a scoring list, or a hatch list and a cargo list. It's kind of up to you to kind of break it up. But it gives you a flexibility to pick based on what you want for your alliance, and it's more clear to you when you're making your alliance to be like, okay, well, we picked up a hatch robot or a robot that's really good at hatches. Now we need to pick up a robot that's really good at cargo. And it makes it clear where a robot's strengths and weaknesses are. Where in the sort of standard method, just by ranking them, you don't necessarily know just by looking at the pick list what that team's strengths and weaknesses are. So things to know when you're making a pick list. One person should have the final say when it comes to a pick list. Make sure that you know who this person is before the picks actually happen. You don't have this just argument about, oh, I want this team and I want this team. Make sure you know who's in charge. Do not talk to other teams about the pick list. Never, ever, ever, unless they're actually on your alliance. Once you've picked them, obviously you can talk to them about your pick list because you want to collaborate. Leave what was talked about in the scouting meeting at scouting meetings, which we'll talk about the scouting meeting in a second. Stay on topic. We can have cool and funny stuff that we're talking about later. We can have that conversation later. We want to make sure that we get through the pick list in an efficient way. One thing that we do and that I highly recommend is only allow scouts to stay for the meeting. People that haven't scouted don't really have that much value in a scouting meeting because they won't have watched matches, they won't have known what the teams have done. And long pick list meetings aren't fun. If you have people who are extra, who don't really have that much of an expertise or interest in it, they're gonna distract you. They're gonna say, they're gonna make jokes. They're gonna delay your pick list meeting. So, objectively defining what kind of alliance you want is really important because you need to know how you can win the event. And when you're making the pick list, if you're not clear on that, you're going to run into a lot of problems. So the start of making a good pick list is you want to start with what kind of alliance you want, what robot traits you're looking for, and what traits you're looking for like first and second picks. So to do that, you want to talk about what your goal of the alliance may be, what kind of alliances you might have to beat, For example, in Higher Ed 2013, uh, one of the most prolific full court shooters, 67 in quarterfinals, played against an alliance that had no robots in the first match that were capable of blocking the full court shooter. And when you don't block a full court shooter in 2013, bad things happen, especially when they're good. So you need to think about and strategize who you're actually going to be playing against and what kind of alliances, what kind of traits, and what kind of things you may need. So, for example, in 2013, if you needed to block a full court shooter, you need to have a robot that's capable of being tall and blocking that. Make sure that these objectives are clear to everyone and preferably write them down so that everybody can see what we're looking for. So, to recap, make sure that we're, know what we're looking for. So if you're, for example, in 2019, if you're really good at hatches and not so great at cargo, you probably want to look for a cargo robot to help supplement some of your weaknesses. Or perhaps in a specific game like 2013, where really the only scoring objective that mattered during Teleop was scoring in the high goal for 3 points each. You just want to have the most the team that's able to score the most in that high goal, and scoring level 2 or level 1 didn't really matter, or in the pyramid. So, making a pick list, where do you start? Well, if applicable, some events, the pick list meeting happens after you know the final rankings. But if you don't know the final rankings, try and predict them. Should be done by one or two people, done simultaneously as other things. So when you're talking about the criteria or stuff, make sure that you're working on that at the same time. Should be done simultaneously with other things, right? So who is locked in a top spot? Who's your likely number one seed? Who's gonna be above us? Who's gonna be below us? Where are we gonna be? Are we gonna be picking or not picking? If we're just outside the top 8, is it likely that we're going to be picking because of the interpicking above us? Uh, where we start after that, after we have a prediction, is based on our criteria that we've already outlined. Uh, rank teams into a couple of tiers. We break it into 5 tiers, which is like elite, good, average, bad, and really bad. So just going through very quickly, like rapid fire, kind of being like, all right, what tier do they belong in? Place them in that tier. Look at them later. This helps when you're kind of comparing teams. You have a general idea of where each team should follow. This should only take like 15 or 20 minutes to go through all of them. Maybe even less, maybe even 10. So the process, so you take your highest tier and you rank them in your pick list for a standard pick. So you take those teams in the like elite tier, so tier 1, and then you rank them. Who's your favorite team? Pick that. Don't spend a lot of time if they're not going to be available. For example, if they're going to outseed you, don't spend a lot of time on them. Just be like, okay, well, this team's probably better than this team. It doesn't matter because you're not going to be able to pick them. When you're almost out of teams in that tier, add the next tier of teams. So once there's like 2 or 3 teams left in tier 1, add the next tier. Make sure that there's nobody better in tier 2 that, after discussing, that is better than somebody in tier 1. So continue until you have about 6 extra teams. So that are available to be picked. So in a standard regional or event, it's 24 teams. So, go to 30. The reason why you do that is because sometimes teams that you're working with have somebody on your pick list or somebody on a pick list, on their pick list that isn't necessarily in your top 24. It's good to talk about teams that are just kind of on the bubble still. Use the same skills that we talked about when we're analyzing data. Make sure that you understand what the data means. Where did the data come from? Why are their averages high or low? What happened in those matches where they were outliers? That sort of stuff. Consider cheesecaking robots to improve them. So adding additional functionality. That's where some of your pit scouting happens. talking to those specific teams. Are they actually willing to cheesecake? Ask them, that kind of stuff. So some of the common trade-offs that you'll run into, and it kind of depends on where you are in the kind of draft. Reliability versus high potential. So, how reliable are they? Are they consistently getting like 3 game pieces versus high potential? So maybe there's a team that can do 6 sometimes, but oftentimes they do 0. Um, Kind of depends on where you're at. Generally, if you're a high seed, you want to pick reliable teams. If you're a low seed, you want to pick high potential or high risk. Robot capability versus team capability. What I mean by that is, what is the robot capable of doing versus, working with the team and how well the team is to work with. Sometimes you may want to bump up a team because you really enjoy working with them and they're really nice people or you really gel with them. That can have a big impact. Cheesecaking versus no cheesecaking. Cheesecaking inherently has a risk. Trying to add a new functionality to their robot is not easy. But sometimes it may be necessary to try and win. So have that kind of discussion. The do not pick list. It is very practical to remove teams from consideration that aren't compatible with you. It's not something that you should ever be talking to with other teams unless you absolutely have to. So, for example, even if you're on an alliance and you're trying to make a selection, you don't want to be like, oh, here's our entire DNP list, the teams who are not going to work with or whatever. Only bring it up if the other team is interested in picking them. What makes a team worthy of DNP? Well, they're incompatible with your team, just like robot wise. So, for example, this year, if you have 2 hatch only robots, that would not be very good because you'd run out of spaces, or maybe all 3 robots can only score on level 1 for 2019. They're be pretty incompatible. Um, Conflicting attitudes. So that's just, you really just don't like working with the team. They have different goals from your perspective. They just wouldn't be a good fit to work with. And then the other reason is they have a really bad robot, so they just can't score. They can't play defense. They're just not good. Things that are not DNP: Mechanum, scissor lifts, first time swerves, butterfly, octocannons, blah 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 blah. All these things are not inherently do not pick worthy. Just because a team has Mechanum or has a scissor lift doesn't mean that you should not pick them. You need to objectively evaluate the team and their strengths. Don't count off teams just because they have, 2 sim drivetrain or butterfly or their swerve is their first time. Maybe they're still the best option. Making a pick list. So the final kind of touches. Have 2 to 3 people who review the list the day of the alliance selection. They make changes as needed. Pay attention to teams that get things working. For example, in practice field, watch the practice field. Maybe a team suddenly gets their autonomous working, or their shooter, or their game piece score. That'll give you steals, and you can move them up on the list. Make notes about these teams. Try to keep teams within the same kind of tier that they started in. So when we originally ranked them by tier, unless there's a drastic change. But don't be afraid to move them around a lot. It's really important to take the most recent accurate data. Don't rely on like their first match of the competition, especially on events that are their first competition, because there's going to be a lot of variance. So actually making picks. Making picks for the alliance selection. Communicate with your field rep. You can do this through a bunch of ways: phone, whiteboard, texting, anything is fine. Make sure that your field rep is prepared for potential scenarios that might happen, and make sure that they know how to respond. So you may be ranked like 11th or 12th. Make sure that the field rep knows that, hey, there's a small outside chance that we are going to be an alliance captain, so be ready for that. If you need to decline a team, make sure that they know how to decline a team. Make sure that they do it in a respectful way. You know, don't be caught off guard if, oh, wow, some team picked us and we need to decline. Make sure that they know who they're declining if somebody picks us or your team. Uh, Advocating for a preferred team. Make sure that they know how to talk to the alliance rep on the field to make sure that they are heard, and you can talk about what team you want to pick and why. You want to be prepared for if a team declines you. Very often, people like go, "Oh, they declined." Make sure that they're aware that that's okay. It doesn't matter. Ignore whatever other people say and what the crowd may be doing. Make sure that they're up to date on whatever sponsor names you want to list if you do that, or puns or funny things that you say when you either accept or try and invite a team. And then the last thing is make sure that you give the representative a version of the current list so that they have a general idea of who is up next. So making picks. Once you make a pick or you are picked, attempt to locate the team and their strategists in the stands, right? And the other thing is you want to scout out the stands previously to look at kind of teams that you might be picking or might be picked by, so you know where they are. The reason why you want to do this is so that you can communicate with them, agree, talk to them throughout the alliance selection, make sure that you're on the same page, pick a team that you both want. Consider scorching if you are a weaker team that's overseeded. It's a really valuable strategy to try and block up some powerful pairs. Make sure that you've gone through all the scorch potential teams, and don't forget them. It's a good thing to do. Always optimize your chances to win. So when is declining good? So you want to decline when a team that's above you is picking you, but there's a whole bunch of different options, and you can for sure get a pick that is better than what they have to offer. When is it good to take risks? Don't just follow your list. This is super important. Don't just follow your list. If you're a low seed, if you're in a position that you weren't expecting to be, take risks if you need to. If you're playing against a super strong alliance, pick the risky team. Take your time. Make sure that you get the team number right. Don't typo, that kind of thing. Make sure you say the right team. There's no time limit. All right, so off-season pick lists. Making a pick list for off seasons. They're way more time constrained. Off seasons are often just one day. Create a pick list going into the event with as much information you can have, you can find. So pre-scout the teams. Um, Pre-scouting is useful to some degree, but make sure that you always update the data. Ignore the pre-scouting list after, or the pre-scouting information after you actually get to that event. Maybe some exceptions would be like sandstorm or autonomous modes, perhaps. But when you're talking about averages, min, max, medians, etc., um, use your current up-to-date data. So what we do for off-season events is we have a pick list going in. With that pick list, we edit it based on moving teams up or down based on their performance. It's just sort of a similar process as editing pick list just before the uh, align selection. So that's the conclusion of the presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope it's a good resource for people. Um, if you have any questions, you can message me or